Welcome back. You're watching The Last Sip. Right now, we're about to have a hard but necessary conversation about the way in which sexual assault unfolds in communities of color, especially amongst Black women and girls. So we are issuing an essential trigger warning in case you wish to avoid a conversation which could exercise trauma. Nearly 1 out of 3 women will face some form of sexual assault in their lifetime, and while incidence of sexual assault is nearly the same for Black women and white women, Black women are more likely to endure these crimes at the hands of someone they know. So too are Native women by an even greater degree. Here to talk about this and the ways in which stereotypes and images of Black women from slavery to the present create a backdrop for this dynamic is Carolyn West, professor of psychology at the University of Washington, Tacoma. Dr. West, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for your work. We really appreciate both for everything that you're able to do.
Thank you for having me.
One of the things that you spotlight is how, for most of this country's history, Black women have not had control of our bodies. Can you talk about that and why that is the case and how that echoes to the present?
Well, as we said, for most of this country's history, African American women were commodities. They were not even seen as human beings. And their sexuality, it was a sexual economy. And the country was built, the wealth of the country was built on forcing Black women to reproduce. So most of the country's history, we didn't have control over our sexuality. And out of this came stereotypes that indicated or argued that Black women were promiscuous, they were sexually irresponsible, that sexual assaults didn't matter against them. And that shaped every social structure, from the economy to the medical community to politics and how we treat sexual assault against Black women even today.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you highlight, and it blew me away when I saw this in your work, is that rape was not illegal for Black women, even when committed by Black men. That is to say that anyone who wanted to have access to a Black woman's body was allowed to do so. Black women didn't have control over their bodies. You really lay it out there. So can you just kind of take us through that from the beginning?
No matter what, I mean, it was an institutional rape that started before when enslaved African Americans were brought here, when enslaved Africans were brought here to this country. They were routinely raped during the transatlantic passage. When they got here, they were stripped naked and sold on auction blocks. They were routinely raped in households by white slave owners. They were also raped by African American enslaved men and free men, and pretty much the culture looked the other way. And then after slavery ended, during Reconstruction, the Ku Klux Klan, other white vigilante groups sexually assaulted African American women with impunity. And then during the Jim Crow era, they were sexually assaulted as they worked as domestics within their own communities. And that pattern of institutional rape within their communities and just across the culture continues today.
One of the groups of women, as you know, that are among the most marginalized in the country are trans women.
For trans women, we end up seeing them as a threat and as predators when the reality is they're more likely to be victimized because they're living at the intersection of multiple forms of oppression. So there's no protection. People don't understand the challenges they face. And with the current policies around bathroom policies and such, they're almost vilified and demonized in ways that is very much of concern. And so we can talk about sexual violence, which is appropriate because it is Sexual Violence Awareness Month. But my concern is with whatever marginalized population that we're talking about, we seem to forget that sexual violence doesn't occur in isolation in the lives of marginalized individuals. They're oftentimes living in a web of trauma So they're oftentimes with a history of childhood sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, community violence, violence in their workplaces or schools, state-sponsored violence from law enforcement. So it's really a web of trauma and violence, and I think that's critical that we remember that as well.
That's exactly right. There's a full range of things at work in sexual violence, and it's important for us to keep that in mind in Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And your work is indispensable in helping us to understand how we got here. I really want to appreciate that work and sort of honor your role in that. And thank you for joining us and for coming on. We really appreciate it. Thank you again for coming on. For sexual assault resources and more information about Dr. West's very fine work, please go to www.thelastSip.org and click on How to Help. We'll be right back.